I want you to picture something right off the bat. Picture a typical modern martial arts class.
Oh, yeah. We all have that exact image burned into our brains.
Right. Like you can probably visualize it perfectly right now. You walk through the double doors of some local strip mall or maybe a community recreation center, and there it
It's
is.
the wide open room, right?
Exactly. The pristine, brightly colored tatami mats. And lined up in these like perfect symmetrical rows are students of all
All
ages.
wearing those blindingly white cotton uniforms.
Yeah, tied together with the brightly colored belts. And at the front of the room, you have an instructor shouting commands in this really crisp, formal Japanese.
Usually with the students bowing respectfully, punching the air in perfect unison.
Yeah, and the whole atmosphere is steeped in this aura of character development, quiet discipline, and ancient respect.
It definitely feels like this highly structured, deeply Japanese tradition, right? Like it's existed in this perfectly polished, almost sterile state for 1,000 years.
The visual language of that space is incredibly powerful.
Oh, totally. You step onto that mat anywhere on the planet,
Yeah.
whether you're in like suburban Ohio, downtown Paris, or Tokyo, and the architecture of that experience is identical.
It projects this image of an unbroken, pure, formalized tradition, but the sources we have piled up on the table today, they basically completely shatter that illusion.
They really do. It's wild when you dig into it.
Because today, we are diving into this massive stack of historical texts, translated dojo genealogies, archival military directives, and documentary transcripts to uncover the true, incredibly messy, and intensely political history of karate.
And I'd say our mission for this deep dive is to map out how an underground, highly secretive, and lethally practical island fighting system was essentially geopolitically sanitized.
Right, sanitized and rebranded to conquer the globe.
Exactly. We are tracking a geopolitical evolution, and it connects three entirely distinct regions.
You've got the vast empire of China, right?
Yep, China. Then the formerly independent Ryukyu kingdom, which is modern-day Okinawa, and then the imperial mainland of Japan.
And looking at the raw historical data, we see a system of combat that was fundamentally transformed over centuries by colonialism, severe economic desperation, language suppression, and honestly, some of the most calculated political rebranding in modern history.
It's a fascinating journey.
I like to think of it like software development, you know? The modern image of karate that you see today, the white belts, the polite bowing, the Olympic sports competitions. It functions like a highly polished corporate app.
Oh, I like that analogy. Yeah, it has a beautiful user interface.
Right. It's completely safe for kids to download, and it has terms of service that everyone agrees to.
But when you look at the actual history, its origin.
The source code is more like a chaotic, underground, open source project. It was coded in the dark by rebels, outcasts, and people who were just desperately trying to survive state violence.
And to find the root of that source code, the historical documents force us to leave mainland Japan entirely.
We have to look south, right?
Yeah, down to the East China Sea. We have to look to the Ryukyu Crucible.
So let's set the geographical stage for everyone. We are talking about a period stretching roughly between 1429 and 1879.
Right. And it's crucial to understand that the Ryukyu kingdom was not Japanese during this time.
Not at all. It was an independent kingdom, essentially a chain of small islands sitting right in the middle of a massive, swirling maritime trade route.
And that geography really dictated their entire culture. Ryukyu was this booming maritime trading hub.
If you look at the shipping logs and trade agreements from that era, you see vessels constantly moving.
Constantly. Between Japan, Korea, the diverse kingdoms of Southeast Asia, and most heavily the Ming and Qing dynasties of China.
So Ryukyu was like the ultimate crossroads.
Exactly. They didn't have massive armies and they didn't have vast natural resources, so their survival depended entirely on diplomacy and trade.
And when you have ships constantly docking and unloading foreign goods, you inevitably get the unloading of foreign ideas.
That's right. And the sources highlight a highly specific, highly influential settlement that acts as the catalyst for this whole story.
In the late 14th century, right?
Yeah, in the late 14th century, a group of Chinese immigrants, known as the 36 families of Min, settled in Kum village.
Which is located in the Okinawan port city of Naha. And these families came from the Fujian province of Ming, China, right?
Yes, but these individuals, they were not just like random laborers looking for a new life. They were heavily vetted, highly educated professionals.
They were essentially sent as state-sponsored expatriates.
Exactly. They held key government positions within the Ryukyu kingdom. They served as diplomats, official interpreters, expert navigators.
Even tribute envoys who facilitated the complex trade relationship between the Ryukyu king and the Chinese emperor, right?
Right, they were this elite bureaucratic class.
And naturally, when an elite class migrates, they bring their cultural technology with them. The sources detail how they brought Chinese martial arts into Kum village.
Specifically, systems rooted in Fujian white crane and other southern Chinese boxing styles.
And over generations, these sophisticated Chinese fighting concepts began to sort of bleed out of the village.
Yeah, they started to blend with the indigenous, pre-existing Okinawan fighting style.
Which was known simply as te, right? Which literally just translates to hand.
Yep, just hand. And the synthesis of those Chinese mechanics and indigenous Okinawan te was gradual at first.
But the historical records show that this cultural exchange was suddenly subjected to this immense, crushing geopolitical pressure.
Because in 1609, the trajectory of this martial art changes forever.
This is the invasion, right?
Yes. The Satsuma domain of Japan, which was a powerful clan located in modern-day Kagoshima at the southernmost tip of the mainland, they launch a brutal invasion of the Ryukyu kingdom.
They essentially turn this independent trading hub into a subjugated vassal state.
And to ensure the local population can never mount a successful rebellion, the Satsuma overlords enforce this draconian policy.
A strict, absolute ban on the possession of weapons.
The implementation of that ban was meticulous, too. Swords, spears, firearms, even certain types of bladed farming implements were confiscated or heavily regulated.
So the occupying samurai class held a total monopoly on armed violence.
Right. And when an occupying force strips a warrior class of their weapons, the biological imperative for self-defense doesn't just vanish.
No, it simply internalizes. Your own skeletal structure, your own limbs, they have to become the weapons.
Exactly. So the Okinawan elite, the royal guards and the aristocrats who are suddenly disarmed, they take this blended art of te and force it to evolve.
Into this devastatingly effective unarmed combat system. But, I mean, they can't exactly open a storefront dojo and advertise their anti-samurai combat classes, right?
Not at all. The sources emphasize the terrifying reality of this era. Training had to be conducted in absolute paranoid secrecy.
We are talking about small groups of men meeting in the dead of night, deep in the forests.
Or behind high-walled family compounds, training in complete silence to avoid drawing the attention of the occupying Japanese patrols.
The psychological environment of that training must have fundamentally shaped the physical art.
Oh, 100%. You are training for a worst-case scenario. An ambush by an armored opponent where you have no weapon.
And from this intense pressure cooker, the historical texts identify three major regional schools of tea emerging, right? Categorized by the specific Okinawan cities they developed in.
Let's break those down, because the geographical differences in the towns created vastly different physical fighting styles.
Okay, first you have Naha-te. Now, Naha was the major commercial port, and crucially, it was home to Kum village.
Right, where those Chinese diplomats lived.
So because of this direct proximity, Naha-te heavily incorporated complex Chinese martial arts concepts. It placed a massive emphasis on breath control, close quarters grappling, and brutal internal physical conditioning.
Exactly. Then you move slightly inland to Shuri.
Shuri was the royal capital, right?
Yes, the absolute seat of the Ryukyu aristocracy and the king's castle. So the martial art developed there, Shuri-te, was practiced almost exclusively by the noble class and the royal bodyguards.
And the mechanics of Shuri-te favored long-range, explosive, linear strikes, and rapid evasion. It was designed to quickly dispatch a threat and protect an elite target.
And finally, you have Tomari-te. Tomari was the second largest trade port on the island.
The sources describe it as a rougher, more transient area.
Yeah, much rougher.
Yeah.
So Tomari-te was heavily influenced by foreign drifters, shipwrecked sailors, and traveling merchants.
People who would bring their own unrefined, pragmatic fighting tricks ashore, trading a technique for a meal or lodging.
Right.
But hold on, looking at the logistics of this, something doesn't track for me.
What's that?
We are talking about people practicing in pitch-black courtyards, terrified of being executed by samurai patrols. If you are just desperately trying to survive an occupation, how do you manage to develop incredibly distinct, highly formalized, biomechanically complex regional style?
That's a great question.
Right, because a peasant desperately throwing punches in the dark doesn't accidentally invent a cohesive system of physics. Did they just get lucky based on which shipwrecked sailor washed up on their beach?
No, the evolution of these styles was not accidental at all. Survival breeds innovation, sure, but it requires genius to systemize that innovation.
Okay.
The historical documents point to specific, brilliant individuals who did not just hide in the dark. They actively sought out external, high-level knowledge to synthesize with their local traditions.
And the most profound example in the sources is a man named Matsumura Sokon, right?
Yes, Matsumura is fascinating.
He was a royal bodyguard, an aristocrat, born around 1809, serving the Ryukyu king.
And he didn't just stay on the island practicing in secret. He was sent abroad on diplomatic missions.
Which is crazy because while dealing with the very forces occupying his home, he managed to study Japanese swordsmanship.
He studied the Jigenryu style directly from the Satsuma domain itself.
And he didn't just dabble in it, right?
No, he earned full teaching mastery. Then, later in life, he traveled to Beijing and studied high-level Chinese martial arts under an imperial palace instructor.
So the cross-training Matsumura engaged in represents the highest possible levels of both the occupying Japanese forces and the Chinese imperial court.
Yes, but the real genius of Matsumura lies in how he applied the physics of one to the other.
Yeah, okay, break that down.
Well, Jigenryu's swordsmanship is uniquely terrifying. It is famous for its one-hit kill ethos.
The philosophy dictates that there is no second strike, right?
Exactly. The practitioner relies on absolute stillness, followed by an explosive, lightning-fast, fully committed downward strike designed to cleave an opponent in half before they can even draw their blade.
So wait, you're saying he took the mechanics of swinging a katana and applied it to a human arm?
That is exactly what he did. He fundamentally translated the kinetic chain of that lethal sword strike into the biomechanics of an empty-handed punch.
Wow.
You know, the way Jigenryu swordsmen would relentlessly strike a standing tree with a wooden sword to build explosive power and grip strength.
Yeah.
Matsumura adapted that into empty hand training. This is the likely origin of the makiwara.
The flexible wooden striking post wrapped in straw, the one modern karate practitioners still punch today to build dense bone calluses.
Exactly. Matsumura took the mental commitment and the structural alignment of a samurai sword strike and fused it with the evasive footwork of Chinese forms. He basically created a hybrid weapon out of human bone and muscle.
So that classic bare-knuckle straight punch that we associate with karate today, the one that starts at the hip and twists into the target, that is literally the ghost of a samurai sword strike translated into an unarmed movement.
It really is. It completely recontextualizes what we are looking at when we see a modern karate class.
It really does. But while Matsumura traveled to China and Japan as this highly respected elite diplomat, the geopolitical landscape of East Asia was about to fracture.
Significantly. As we move into the late 19th century, modernized Japan looks at the Ryukyu kingdom and decides the era of a vassal state is over.
Right. In 1879, the Meiji government officially abolishes the Ryukyu kingdom. They depose the king, annex the islands entirely, and rename it Okinawa Prefecture.
And that abolition triggered a devastating social collapse for the Okinawan aristocracy.
Because the traditional systems of patronage that supported the royal bodyguards and the masters of Te just vanished overnight.
Oof, gone. The masters were suddenly stripped of their stipends and their social standing.
But the social crisis escalated into an existential terror in 1897, right?
Yes. That's when the Japanese Meiji government enforced universal military conscription in Okinawa. They began actively drafting Okinawan men into the Imperial Japanese Army.
I mean, imagine the psychological horror of that. The mainland government dismantles your entire civilization, demotes your people to second-class citizens, and then hands you a rifle and demands you shed your blood to expand their empire.
It's unthinkable. And many Okinawans wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. You suddenly have this wave of young men, desperate draft evaders, fleeing the islands by any means necessary.
And the sources detail the harrowing story of a 20-year-old man named Kanbun Yuchi.
Kanbun Yuichi's escape in 1897 was an incredible gamble. To evade the draft, he knew he had to leave Japanese territory entirely.
So, under the cover of darkness, fully aware that he would face severe military punishment if caught by the authorities, he secured passage on a small vessel and made a clandestine, dangerous journey across the East China Sea.
Heading to Qing Dynasty China.
He lands in the Fujian province, and the sources say Fujian was, chaotic, bustling, and completely alien to him.
But he manages to find a community of other Okinawan exiles, known historically as the Dashan Min, who had also fled the Japanese government.
And through these connections, he eventually meets a Chinese martial arts master named Zhu Ziyu.
Right, whose name the Okinawans pronounced as Shushiwa.
Uechi pleaded for instruction, and Shushiwa eventually accepted him. But the training Uechi underwent in Fujin was not about learning hundreds of flashy techniques.
No, you learned a style called Pangai Noon.
And the translation of Pangai Noon is half hard, half soft. But what does that actually mean in a physiological sense? Because, I mean, half soft sounds like a terrible strategy for a fist fight.
Yeah, it does sound counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But the terminology describes the biomechanical state of the muscles and the tactical approach to incoming force.
Okay, explain that.
Well, softness in Chinese martial arts does not mean weakness. It means yielding, deflecting, and absorbing kinetic energy like water.
So it's about not resisting force on force.
Exactly. It is the ability to relax the muscles completely so that you can move with blinding speed and redirect an opponent's attack.
And the hard part.
The hardness is the sudden, explosive, crystallizing tension at the exact moment of impact. You are relaxed until the microsecond your strike lands, turning your fist into a cannonball and then instantly relaxing again.
Wow. And to achieve that kind of neurological control, his master put him through absolute hell, didn't he?
Absolute hell. The sources state that Shushiwa forced Uechi to practice one single foundational sequence of movements, a kata called Senshin, for 3 full years before teaching him anything else.
3 years of one routine, that is insane.
And the physical reality of Senshin training is brutal. It is an intense isometric breathing form.
You grip the floor with your toes like talons, right?
Yeah, you lock your hips, engage your glutes, and tense every muscle in your core and upper body while performing very slow, heavily resistant breathing.
And while you are doing this, the instructor systematically strikes your arms, legs, and torso with a heavy bamboo rod.
The goal is to forge a neuromuscular armor, fundamentally increasing bone density and thickening the fascia through constant micro-trauma and healing.
So Senshin basically physically remodels the human body to withstand massive blunt force trauma.
It does, and it worked. Uechi endured it. In 1904, Shushiwa formally recognized his mastery and entrusted him with the complete transmission of the Pangai Noon system.
Uechi even achieved something that was virtually unheard of for an Okinawan immigrant, right? He successfully opened his own martial arts dojo in China, teaching Chinese students.
Which is incredible. He made his living selling herbal medicines on the street and demonstrating his terrifying physical conditioning.
He had reached the absolute pinnacle of his art. He was a recognized master in a foreign land.
But the historical records reveal a devastating turning point that completely shattered his life.
What happened?
Uechi had trained several students in the lethal applications of Pangai Noon, and one of his Chinese students found himself in a bitter dispute over a land boundary.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The dispute escalated into violence, and the student used the precise, deadly techniques Uechi had taught him to strike and kill the other man.
Wow. And when Uechi found out, the guilt was absolute. He viewed the death as his own failure, didn't he?
Completely. He believed that the sacred art he had suffered so much to learn had been degraded into a simple tool for murder.
And the psychological weight of that realization just broke him. He immediately closed his dojo, packed whatever he could carry, and brought his 13-year life in China to a sudden end.
In 1910, he returned to Okinawa.
But he returned with a solemn, unbreakable vow. He would never speak of his martial arts again, and he would never teach another soul.
He buried his identity. He moved to a remote mountainous area of Okinawa called Izumi, bought a small plot of land, and lived quietly as a simple radish farmer.
For over a decade, his neighbors had absolutely no idea that the quiet farmer living next to them was one of the most lethal hand-to-hand combatants on the planet.
It's a heavy narrative.
It really is. It's like a classic superhero trope. You know, a man achieves ultimate power, realizes the danger of that power, and intentionally exiles himself to a life of quiet anonymity.
Exactly like that.
Except this was a devastating historical reality, and he fully intended to take his knowledge to the grave. But the macroeconomics of the 1920s had a different plan for Okinawa.
They did. While Uechi was pulling radishes out of the dirt, the entire Okinawan economy completely collapsed.
The sources refer to this period with a terrifying historical phrase, right?
Yes. So Tetsujigoku, which translates to Sago Palm Hell.
The economic devastation of the 1920s really cannot be overstated. There was a massive drop in the price of sugar, which was Okinawa's main cash crop, combined with severe typhoons.
It completely wiped out the agricultural sector.
And the term Sago Palm Hell refers to the grim reality that the population was literally starving to death.
Yes. To survive, people were forced to scavenge the mountains for the sago palm plant, the cycad.
But the heart of this plant is highly toxic.
Extremely toxic. If it isn't washed and fermented through a long, painstaking process, consuming it causes severe neurological damage and death.
People were so desperate for calories they were eating poisonous plants and dying from improper preparation.
It was horrific. And when an entire population is pushed to the brink of starvation, migration is the only option left.
This economic apocalypse forced massive waves of desperate Okinawans to abandon their ancestral island.
They boarded ships heading north, seeking any kind of menial labor in the heavy, smoke-choked industrial hubs of mainland Japan.
They formed these tight-knit, heavily discriminated against migrant communities in the textile mills of the Kansai region, in Kawasaki, and in the brutal industrial slums of Surumi.
And hidden within those waves of desperate factory workers migrating to the mainland were many of the greatest surviving Okinawan martial arts masters.
Including Kanbun Yuichi.
Yes. In 1924, at the age of 47, Yuichi realized he could no longer feed his family through farming.
So he left Okinawa and moved to Wakayama Prefecture on the mainland, eventually finding a grueling job in a spinning mill.
And even in the miserable conditions of a 1920s textile mill, Yuichi was still keeping his vow of silence.
But the human body tells a story that words can't hide.
That's right. A young Okinawan man named Ryu Tomoyose, who was also working in Wakayama, started noticing Yuichi.
Tomoyose had some martial arts background, right? And he recognized the way Yuichi moved.
Yes, the physical conditioning, the structural alignment, the way he carried his weight. It was obvious to a trained eye that this older mill worker was hiding something profound.
So Tomoyose confronted him. He realized that this quiet man held the key to a lost system of combat.
And Tomoyose relentlessly begged Yuichi to teach him.
He pleaded with him for months, visiting him constantly, trying to convince him that the art needed to survive, that it could be used for self-discipline rather than violence.
And finally, the sheer persistence breaks through the trauma.
In 1926, after 16 years of absolute silence, at the age of 49, Kanbun Yuichi broke his vow.
He began teaching Tomoyose in secret, and eventually he established a research institute in Wakayama.
And this was the birth of Uechi-ryu, an art that miraculously preserved the terrifying, unadulterated Chinese training methods of Pangai Noon right in the middle of mainland Japan.
The mechanics of Uechi-ryu are astonishing. Because it evolved from southern Chinese systems designed to penetrate armor or strike vital points, it utilizes techniques that turn the extremities of the body into literal weapons.
Like they don't just punch with a closed fist, do they?
No, they use the shokin, a strike delivered with the single protruding joint of the thumb. They use the nukite, devastating spear hand strikes with the fingertips aimed at the throat or eyes.
And most famously, they use the sokusenjari, right?
Yes, a kick delivered precisely with the extended tips of the toes, designed to rupture organs or break ribs.
Delivering a full-force kick with the tips of your toes sounds like a guaranteed way to shatter your own foot. How is that physically possible?
It relies on a principle called Wolff's Law, which dictates that bone will adapt to the loads under which it is placed.
Oh, okay.
In Uechi-ryu, practitioners spend years slowly conditioning their toes against wooden boards, creating microfractures that heal denser and stronger, until the skeletal structure of the foot completely alters.
And they also practice kotai, right? That brutal body conditioning drill.
Yes, where practitioners strip to the waist and violently strike each other's forearms, thighs, and torsos with full-force blows.
They're systematically killing the nerve endings and calcifying the bones until their limbs are as hard as steel pipes.
Exactly.
We have to acknowledge the massive historical irony unfolding here.
Oh, it's profound.
Let's trace the causality. The Imperial Japanese mainland annexes Okinawa. They impose military conscription, which forces a young man to flee to China and learn a lethal art. Years later, that same imperial government's economic policies trigger a collapse that starves the Okinawan people. And to escape starvation, that master brings his lethal art directly into the industrial heart of the Japanese mainland to work in their factories.
The Japanese mainland accidentally created the perfect fertile ground for Okinawan martial arts to take root within its own borders.
It's crazy. If the Okinawan economy had thrived, Kanbun Yuichi would have died a silent radish farmer in Izumi.
Instead, the brutality of the 20th century economy forced him and many other masters to plant the seeds of these highly sophisticated killing arts in the slums of Osaka, Tokyo, and Wakayama.
So by the late 1920s, you have these battle-tested masters living in the mainland slums. You have Uechi and you have others like Chokimotobu, who we will talk about shortly, essentially bringing raw underground fighting to the working class.
But if this Okinawan art was going to survive, if it was going to gain official legitimacy and become the global phenomenon it is today, it couldn't stay in the slums.
Right, because the mainland Japanese elite, the university professors, the politicians, the high-ranking military officers, they were never going to embrace a brutal street fighting system taught by illiterate factory workers speaking a broken foreign dialect.
Exactly. The art desperately needed an ambassador. It needed a linguistic and cultural bridge.
And the historical texts clearly identify the man who built that bridge, Gichin Funakoshi.
Funakoshi is often celebrated as the father of modern karate, but his primary weapon wasn't his fists.
It was his education, wasn't it?
Yes. Looking at Funakoshi's background, he was not a terrifying street brawler. He was born in Shuri, the old capital, but he was a highly educated, deeply literate schoolteacher.
He wrote poetry, he was a master of traditional calligraphy. But the most vital asset he possessed was his flawless command of standard mainland Japanese.
Which was huge, because the language barrier between Okinawa and mainland Japan was an insurmountable wall at that time.
The mainland Japanese viewed traditional Okinawan culture as primitive and backwards.
And more importantly, the native Okinawan language, uchi-noguchi, is completely unintelligible to a standard Japanese speaker. It's not just an accent, it's a distinct linguistic branch.
And the sources highlight a horrific policy enacted in the Okinawan school systems during the Meiji era to illustrate this prejudice.
Right, the dialect tags.
Yes. The mainland government installed standard Japanese as the only legal language of instruction. If Okinawan children were caught speaking their native uchi-noguchi in the schoolyard, they were punished by being forced to wear dialect tags, heavy wooden boards hung around their necks on a string.
They had to wear these tags of shame until they caught another student speaking the native tongue and passed it on. It was a vicious, state-sponsored campaign of linguistic trauma and cultural erasure.
That psychological trauma explains exactly why a rugged, heavily accented Okinawan fighter from the Tomari docks could never walk into a Tokyo university and demand respect.
The mainland elite would have viewed him with complete contempt.
But Funakoshi bypassed that prejudice.
He did. He was eloquent, he was deeply philosophical, he dressed impeccably, he could explain the biomechanics of Okinawan-te using the refined, poetic vocabulary of the Japanese mainland elite.
And because he was culturally palatable, Funakoshi gets the invitation that changes history.
In 1916, and then again on a much larger scale in 1922, the Japanese Ministry of Education invites Funakoshi to Tokyo to demonstrate the Okinawan art.
Which was still known at the time as Tudi, right?
Yes, Tudi.
Yeah.
And sitting in the audience, watching this polite schoolteacher perform his katas at this national exhibition is Jigoro Kano.
Jigoro Kano was an intellectual titan in mainland Japan. He was the founder of Kodokan Judo.
Right. And Kano had already achieved what Funakoshi was attempting. He had taken the brutal, disjointed feudal arts of jujitsu and refined them into judo, a formalized system of physical education and moral development that the Japanese state fully endorsed.
So Kano held massive political and cultural influence. Funakoshi performs, and Kano is mesmerized by the distinct linear striking mechanics, which judo lacked.
So Kano invites Funakoshi to the Kodokan to demonstrate the art to his top judo instructors.
And Funakoshi is incredibly respectful. He doesn't challenge the judokas to a bloody brawl to prove his style is better. He respectfully shares his knowledge, emphasizing the character-building aspects of the katas.
Kano is so impressed that he uses his immense political leverage to help Funakoshi stay in Tokyo, securing him housing and teaching positions at prestigious universities like Keio and Waseda.
So Funakoshi had successfully infiltrated the elite institutions.
Yes. But as he began establishing university clubs, he and the other Okinawan masters on the mainland ran into a massive existential political crisis.
The problem was the actual name of the art. The branding was a geopolitical disaster.
It really was. The Okinawan name for the art, Tudi, was written with two kanji characters. The first character literally translates to Tang, referencing the Tang dynasty, which functioned as a catch-all term for China.
And the second character was hand. The art was literally called Chinese hand.
That name proudly acknowledged the deep roots of the Fujian white crane and Pangai noon systems that had migrated to Okinawa centuries earlier.
But as the timeline inches toward the late 1920s and early 1930s, the geopolitical climate in East Asia is rapidly darkening.
The sources outline the rising terror. In 1931, the Japanese military stages the Mukden incident.
Right, where they dynamite a section of their own railway in Manchuria and blame Chinese dissidents to justify a full-scale invasion of northeastern China.
Exactly. The Japanese government is sliding rapidly into hyper-militarism, xenophobic nationalism, and preparing for a massive, brutal war against China.
And within mainland Japan, the Kempeitai, the secret military police, were aggressively hunting down anything deemed anti-Japanese or subversive.
In that environment, walking into a Tokyo university asking the nationalist government to fund and officially adopt a martial art explicitly called Chinese Hand was not just difficult, it was functionally treasonous.
It would invite investigation, imprisonment, or the total suppression of the art.
So the Okinawan masters realize they are holding a ticking time bomb. Between 1929 and 1936, the leaders of the Okinawan martial arts community gather and execute one of the most brilliant, desperate pieces of political rebranding in history.
They need to sever the linguistic tie to China, but they don't want to change the spoken name of the art that everyone is already using.
And this is where the linguistic complexity of the Japanese writing system provided a miraculous escape hatch.
Because in Japanese, the kanji character for Tang or China is pronounced kara, right?
Yes, and the masters realized that there was an entirely different kanji character that was also pronounced kara, but its meaning was completely different.
It meant empty.
Yes, they swapped the character. The pronunciation remains exactly the same, karate, but suddenly it no longer means Chinese hand, it means empty hand.
And to sell this change to the Japanese elite, they wrap it in high-minded Zen Buddhist philosophy, quoting the Heart Sutra, "Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form."
They claim empty hand represents the practitioner clearing their mind of selfish desires.
Now, I have to stop and aggressively challenge this narrative. I'm looking at this from a 21st century perspective, and this looks like absolute cowardice.
I can see why you'd say that.
They are dealing with a fascist, hyper-nationalist regime that considers their Okinawan culture inferior and is preparing to slaughter their historical allies in China. And instead of standing their ground or just quietly returning to Okinawa, these masters actively scrubbed their own history clean.
Your reaction is completely understandable from a modern, peaceful vantage point. It looks like cultural surrender.
They erased their Chinese heritage and handed their beloved art over to the very military machine that was oppressing them. How is this celebrated as a brilliant move? Isn't it just total capitulation?
You have to contextualize the absolute suffocating terror of Imperial Japan in the 1930s. This was not a debate over cultural pride. It was a matter of literal life and death.
So they had no choice.
If they had stubbornly clung to the name Chinese Hand, the art wouldn't have just been unpopular. It would have been eradicated by the state. The masters would have been arrested by the Kempeitai as dissidents. Their students would have been expelled from universities.
The knowledge would have died in prison cells. So the rebranding was a camouflage. They dressed the Okinawan art in a Japanese uniform so it could survive the winter of fascism.
Exactly. And the tactic worked flawlessly.
In 1934, the Dai Nippon Butokukai, the DNBK, which was the massive, incredibly powerful state-sponsored umbrella organization that controlled all martial arts in Japan, officially recognized and adopted this newly branded karate-do as a legitimate, formalized Japanese martial art.
They severed the Chinese roots on paper, granted official teaching titles to the Okinawan masters, and fully assimilated the island art into the mainland imperial education system.
Funakoshi secured the survival of the art, but to get it into the physical education curriculum of the universities, Funakoshi had to heavily sanitize what was actually being taught.
Yes, he did. Because his goal was spiritual refinement and character development, Funakoshi focused his curriculum almost entirely on the solo, choreographed routines, the katas.
He completely removed the eye gouges, the groin strikes, and most importantly, he forbade live, unscripted sparring.
He believed that free sparring bred ego and violence.
But when you take a martial art that was fundamentally forged in the life-or-death struggles of the Ryukyu Islands, and you deliberately remove the actual combat testing, you are going to create massive internal friction.
Oh, absolutely. Funakoshi's sanitization sparked a furious rebellion among the other masters and the younger fighters who intimately understood what the physics of the art were actually designed to do.
And the primary antagonist in this rebellion against Funakoshi's polite university karate was a man named Choki Motobu.
If Funakoshi was the refined poet, Motobu was the apex predator of the Okinawan martial arts world.
He was born into the highest levels of the Ryukyu aristocracy, but he was the third son, meaning he wasn't entitled to the family's secret martial arts teachings.
So Motobu taught himself by spying on the masters, and he pressure-tested his raw techniques by intentionally picking brutal street fights in the red-light districts of Naha.
Motobu was a pragmatist. He despised Funakoshi's kata-only approach.
He publicly stated that it was heartbreaking to see the devastating traditional Okinawan techniques being destroyed and carelessly altered to please Tokyo politicians.
Motobu firmly believed that a martial art without actual violent combative testing was an empty dance. And he didn't just write angry letters about it. He proved his philosophy on a national stage.
The Kyoto fight, right?
Yes. In November 1922, at the age of 52, Motobu was visiting Kyoto and attended a massive exhibition match. A giant, highly skilled Russian boxer was taking on all challengers and absolutely destroying the local judo and jujitsu fighters.
And Motobu, a man well into his 50s wearing a traditional kimono, spontaneously volunteers, steps into the ring with this towering boxer.
The bell rings, the boxer steps in to deliver a heavy blow, and Motobu instantly slips inside the boxer's reach, evades the punch, and strikes the boxer in the temple with a single, devastating knuckle strike.
He knocks the massive Russian completely unconscious in seconds.
A 52-year-old Okinawan man one-shotting a giant foreign boxer made national newspaper headlines across Japan.
It was irrefutable proof that the original unsanitized Okinawan striking mechanics were terrifyingly effective in live combat.
And this demand for live combat wasn't just coming from the Okinawans. One of Funakoshi's own top mainland students, a man named Hironori Otsuka, also joined the sparring rebellion.
Otsuka is a fascinating case study because he was already a certified master of Shindo Yoshinryu Jiu-Jitsu before he ever met Funakoshi.
Because of his deep understanding of jujitsu body mechanics, leverage, balance breaking, and offlining, Otsuka learned the 15 katos Funakoshi brought from Okinawa incredibly quickly.
But Otsuka was deeply frustrated by the lack of sparring. He knew from his jiu-jitsu background that you cannot master timing and distance without a resisting opponent.
So, when Funakoshi repeatedly refused to allow free sparring, Otsuka essentially went behind his back.
Right, Otsuka sought out other fighters, including Choki Motobu himself, to learn the practical applications of the strikes.
And Otsuka then did something brilliant. He took the explosive, linear, bone-crushing, striking mechanics of Okinawan karate and merged them with the circular, yielding, evasive footwork of Japanese jiu-jitsu.
If a strike comes in, you don't block it force on force. You slip to the side, let their momentum carry them forward, and strike them while their balance is broken.
He created yakusoku kumai prearranged sparring drills to safely train this timing. This philosophical split eventually forced Otsuka to leave Funakoshi entirely and establish Wado-ryu,
which translates to the way of harmony and remains one of the 4 major styles of modern karate.
So we see this intense generative tension pulling the art in 2 directions. Funakoshi pulling it toward a spiritual, educational practice, and fighters like Motobu and Otsuka pulling it back toward a devastating combat system.
But just as this sparring rebellion is truly gaining momentum, the entire Japanese martial arts ecosystem is suddenly wiped off the map.
Because the timeline hits 1945. World War II ends. The Japanese Empire is defeated, the mainland is firebombed into ruins, and the nation is occupied by the Allied forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur.
And the General Headquarters, the GHQ, analyzes the culture that fueled the Japanese war machine. They look directly at the Dai Nippon Butokukai, the organization that had centralized all martial arts and infused them with imperial militaristic propaganda.
The GHQ issues a sweeping, draconian directive. They completely dismantle the DNBK and strictly ban the teaching and practice of all Japanese martial arts.
Judo, kendo, karate all outlawed overnight. The occupying forces correctly identified that these arts had been utilized as psychological tools of imperial militarism.
The ban was absolute. The dojos were shuttered, the masters were forbidden from gathering.
For an art that relies entirely on physical transmission from teacher to student, a multi-year ban is an existential threat. If a generation misses their training, the deep biomechanical knowledge is lost forever.
The lineages could have been permanently broken. But history loves a loophole.
It really does. The sources reveal one of the most bizarre, crucial, and ironic twists in the entire history of striking arts.
Because the GHQ directive was a legal document and it had a massive legal blind spot, the ban was written specifically to suppress Japanese citizens.
And this brings us to the complex status of the Korean population living in Japan.
Right. During the colonial period, Koreans were subjects of the Japanese Empire. But after the defeat of Japan and the liberation of Korea, their legal status in mainland Japan became highly ambiguous.
Many Zaidichi Koreans were legally classified by the occupying forces as third country persons.
Because they were classified as third country persons, the strict GHQ ban on martial arts did not legally apply to them. They were immune to the directive.
The Korean loophole. The historical documents point to a specific location in Tokyo called the Kanbukan, which translates to the Hall of Korean Martial Arts.
It was nominally run by a Korean national named Yoon Hee-bong. Because the director and many of the senior instructors were Korean, the dojo had an ironclad legal shield.
They could openly train and spar in the middle of Tokyo without fear of getting raided by the American military police.
They were a sanctioned sanctuary in a country where martial arts were illegal, and the men operating inside that legal sanctuary were not practicing polite, sanitized university forms.
They were absolute monsters of combat. One of the primary instructors was a Korean national named Nichu.
So Nichu was the top disciple of Gogen Yamaguchi, the head of the brutal, close-quarters Goju-ryu style.
Nichu was a massive, incredibly powerful fighter who had been heavily involved in rough nationalist street politics. He was a man who understood violence intimately, and he kept the flame of heavy, full contact striking alive during the darkest period of the post-war occupation.
And this is where the lineage of modern combat sports is forged. Because training directly under Soto at this GHQ-proof dojo was a young, intensely dedicated Korean-born man originally named Choi Young-il.
We know him by the Japanese name he adopted, Mas Oyama.
Mas Oyama. Even outside of deep martial arts circles, his name carries a mythological weight.
Oyama would eventually leave the Kanbukan and found Kyokushin karate, the ultimate truth. Oyama looked at the non-contact, point-sparring rules that traditional karate was beginning to adopt, and he completely rejected them.
He believed that if you couldn't hit an opponent with full force, you were living in a fantasy. He demanded bare-knuckle, full-contact, knockout fighting.
Oyama's philosophy was shaped by the practical brutality of Goju-ryu, but the sources reveal a fascinating, esoteric influence from his childhood.
Right, Oyama was deeply influenced by a mysterious Korean and northern Chinese practice he witnessed as a youth in Manchuria called chakuri,
or borrowed power.
The story in the texts sounds almost magical until you break down the physics. Oyama witnessed a frail, elderly Korean man use chakuriki to effortlessly strike down a massive, muscular Mongolian wrestler.
The philosophy of chakuriki is not about building massive biceps. It's about drawing out hidden potential and borrowing energy from the external environment.
Biomechanically, borrowed power refers to the absolute optimization of the kinetic chain. It involves utilizing ground reaction force, dropping your center of mass perfectly in sync with a strike, utilizing gravity and rotational momentum, and synchronizing breath to recruit 100% of the body's motor units into a single focal point.
You aren't hitting the opponent with the muscles of your arm. You are hitting them with the entire mass of the planet beneath your feet. Oyama combined this deeply internal, almost mystical bodily awareness of chakuriki with the devastating close-quarters techniques he learned at the Kanbukan.
Oyama took himself into the mountains for months of solitary, ascetic, training striking trees, leaping over rocks, living in absolute isolation to forge the synthesis.
When he returned, he founded Kyokushin. It was so violent, so uncompromising, that the traditional sanitized university schools mocked it as just brawling or street fighting.
But Oyama didn't care about their approval. He proved his art by fighting bulls, taking on all challengers, and hosting massive, full-contact tournaments.
Kyokushin became a global empire of pain and resilience. It eventually spawned the sport of kickboxing in Japan, and its practitioners traveled to the Netherlands, heavily influencing the legendary, devastating Dutch kickboxing scene we see in modern combat sports today.
If we pull back and look at the macro narrative, the historical irony is staggering. Let's trace it one more time.
Go for it.
A martial art is violently suppressed and driven underground by Japanese occupiers in Okinawa. It is stripped of its Chinese heritage and politically rebranded by Japanese nationalists to serve the imperial state. Then, when that imperial state collapses and the art is targeted for total extinction by the American military, it is ultimately saved and nurtured back to health by Korean immigrants exploiting a U.S. military legal loophole.
It is a profound testament to the adaptability of human survival. The art simply refused to die. The Korean masters in Japan preserved and hardened the Japanese art when the Japanese themselves were forbidden from practicing it.
It perfectly illustrates that martial arts are never static traditions handed down cleanly from a master on a mountaintop. They are chaotic, living, breathing entities.
The biomechanics are continually shaped by war, by legal definitions, by migration patterns, and by the political survival instincts of the people practicing them.
Okay, so while Masayama's Kyokushin and Funakoshi Shotokan are exploding in popularity, organizing tournaments, and beginning their massive conquest of the global market, we have to look back at the origins.
What is happening to the birthplace of the art?
What is happening in Okinawa? Because while the mainland was recovering and exporting their sanitized version of karate, Okinawa was left completely tragically isolated.
The post-war reality for Okinawa was a nightmare. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 was the only full-scale ground battle fought on Japanese soil. The devastation was absolute.
A quarter of the civilian population was killed. Entire cities were reduced to ash. The ancient castles, the historical documents, the centuries-old dojos annihilated.
And unlike mainland Japan, which regained its political sovereignty relatively quickly in 1952, Okinawa was severed from Japan. It remained under strict, direct United States military occupation for decades, all the way until 1972.
They were effectively a stateless people. They used U.S. military scrip and eventually U.S. dollars instead of yen. They drove on the right side of the road.
If an Okinawan wanted to travel to mainland Japan, they needed a special passport issued by the U.S. military. They were completely cut off from the massive, booming economic miracle that was rapidly rebuilding the Japanese mainland in the 1960s.
But this geographic and political isolation had a bizarre, highly impactful side effect on the martial art.
Right. The surviving Okinawan masters were struggling to feed their families in a devastated, occupied economy. Their only viable source of income was the massive influx of young, aggressive U.S. soldiers stationed at the sprawling military bases on the island.
So the masters began teaching these soldiers. The soldiers paid in U.S. dollars, which was vital for the masters' survival.
The Okinawan masters didn't teach the soldiers the sanitized, polite university forms. They taught them the brutal, practical, close-quarters combat applications.
And when those tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers finished their deployments and rotated back to the States, they took that raw Okinawan karate with them.
Opening dojos in garages and strip malls across America, accidentally fueling the massive explosion of martial arts in the West during the 60s and 70s.
But while the art was conquering the globe, a deep, bitter cultural fracture was widening back home. The divide between the authentic, pragmatic Okinawan karate and the highly formalized, sport-oriented mainland Japanese karate was growing massive.
And the sources detail a specific event where this cultural fracture erupted into open conflict. In 1972, the U.S. occupation ended, and Okinawa finally reverted to Japanese administration. The following year, in 1973, Okinawa was scheduled to participate in the Kaiho National Sports Festival.
This was supposed to be a joyous reunion. Okinawa is finally back as a Japanese prefecture, and they are preparing their athletes for the national tournament.
But the mainland authority, the Japanese Karate Federation, drops a bureaucratic bombshell.
They inform the Okinawan masters that they are not allowed to perform authentic Okinawan katas in the competition.
The JKF mandated that only the modernized, altered mainland versions of the forms, the ones that Funakoshi and the DMBK had sanitized and Japanese-aidicized decades ago, were officially recognized.
The insult to the Okinawan masters was profound. These elders had survived the Battle of Okinawa. They had preserved the original forms, the original lethal techniques of their ancestors through starvation and war.
And now, the massive mainland organization, which had originally learned the art from Okinawa just 50 years earlier, was dictating to them that their authentic traditions were invalid for national competition.
It is infuriating to read. It's like taking the analogy we used at the beginning to the extreme. It is exactly like a massive, ruthless tech corporation buying out the brilliant, small, open-source developers who invented the software.
Right. The corporation rewrites all the underlying code, removes the complex features to make it a mass-market commercial product, and then tells the original visionary developers that they aren't allowed to use the software anymore unless they conform to the new corporate terms of service.
They stole the art, changed the rules, and locked the creators out.
The Okinawan masters were outraged. They refused to yield, arguing that they needed to participate to slowly reform the JKF from within and force them to respect the original traditions.
But the reality of modern bureaucracy is that the mainland federation held all the structural and financial power. The Okinawan protests were largely ignored, and their requests for traditional recognition were rejected.
And the sources emphasize that this rejection is not just a petty dispute about how high a referee scores a kick in a sports tournament. This is the culmination of a century of cultural erasure.
Absolutely. The JKF's refusal to recognize the Okinawan forms is a direct structural continuation of the Meiji-era assimilation policies. It is the modern equivalent of forcing children to wear the dialect tags around their necks.
By invalidating the authentic Okinawan katas, the mainland federation actively invalidates the unique history, the biomechanical genius, and the specific native language embedded within those movements.
Today, because of the immense financial and social pressure of the Olympic pathway and national tournaments, competitive mainland-style sport karate is becoming the dominant force even within Okinawa itself.
Young Okinawans today are going to local dojos
Mhm.
and learning the sanitized corporate version of their own ancestors' art, simply because that's what wins medals.
And as that happens, the native Okinawan language, Uchinaguchi, which holds the actual phonetic keys to understanding the original meanings and applications behind the ancient movements, is fading into silence.
The texts note the tragic reality that many young Okinawans today cannot even understand the casual conversations spoken by their own grandparents.
The language is dying, and with it, the soul of the martial art is being completely Japanesized.
Which forces us to look at the global landscape of the art today with a completely different perspective.
Let's pull all these threads together. This has been an unbelievable journey. We started by looking at the maritime trade routes of the East China Sea, watching diplomats bring Chinese white crane to a tiny island.
We watched that island suffer a brutal weapons ban, forcing the royal guards to translate samurai sword strikes into bare-knuckle punches in the dead of night.
We followed a desperate master fleeing military conscription to Fujian, enduring 3 years of bone-crushing isometric tension, only to lock away his lethal skills in grief.
We saw macroeconomic starvation force those skills out of the mountains and into the smoke-filled industrial slums of mainland Japan.
We saw a polite, poetic schoolteacher execute a brilliant, desperate linguistic rebranding to save the art from fascist secret police.
And we saw how a legal loophole exploited by Zainichi Koreans saved the art from a post-war American ban, launching Kyokushin into global domination, while the original masters in Okinawa fought a losing battle against bureaucratic cultural erasure.
It is a history defined by profound, almost unbelievable paradoxes. A desperate weapon of anti-colonial resistance was transformed into a tool of imperial physical education. And art forged in absolute terrified silence became a massive, screaming global sports spectacle.
And understanding that constant violent metamorphosis brings up a critical contradiction regarding how we view the art today. It actually leads to this unmentioned concept we haven't touched on yet, something I think is really important for everyone to ponder.
What's that?
The modern martial arts world is obsessed with the concept of tradition. Instructors pride themselves on teaching techniques exactly, perfectly as they were handed down from the founders. They treat the katas like fragile museum pieces that must never be altered. But if the deep original meanings of the katas were tied to the native Okinawan language, a language that was beaten out of the population by the mainland government, then today, when millions of people around the world practice karate forms, are they essentially speaking a dead language with their bodies? Are they perfectly preserving physical words that humanity no longer remembers the definition of?
Wow. The ultimate paradox. Preserving perfectly the shape of a word without having any idea what the word actually means. That is a brilliant, heavy thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you walk past a community center and you see a white belt stepping onto a tatami mat, bowing respectfully to the instructor, look a little closer. You are not just watching a formalized sport, you are watching the living echoes of a geopolitical survival story.